Hello, I'm Sean Kennedy. I'm the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Nursing. You're listening to a podcast in our Behind the Article series, which are interviews with authors of AJN articles. You can find all of our podcasts on our website, ajnonline.com, under the Multimedia tab, as well as on iTunes, Spotify, and Google. AJN's content, including the article we refer to in this podcast, is accessible online on our website, ajnonline.com. You can also find AJN content on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our blog, AJN Off the Charts. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Courtney Keeler, who is an associate professor at the University of San Francisco School of Nursing and Health Professions. Dr. Keeler is co-author of the article in the April issue, Secondary Data in Nursing Research, which she wrote with colleague Dr. Alexa Curtis, who is the Assistant Dean of Graduate Nursing and Director of the MPH DNP Dual Degree Program, also at the University of San Francisco School of Nursing and Health Professions. This is the 9th article in this series, Nursing Research Step by Step, which is produced in collaboration with the Heilbronn Family Center for Research Nursing at Rockefeller University in New York City. The series is designed to give clinical nurses the knowledge and skills they need to evaluate and participate in research step by step. Each column presents a different research concept or method, from research design to data interpretation, and the column appears every other month in AJN. This particular column introduces the reader to secondary data, which is data collected by others. So Courtney, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat about the article.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk about it.
So the series has been very well received, and we're just so happy that it's such a collaborative effort among your teammates there at the University of San Francisco and Rockefeller. So it's really great bringing the two coasts together. So
it is, yes.
So in talking about this particular article, can you, before we really get more into the article, could you briefly clarify, what you mean by primary versus secondary data and why a researcher might use one versus the other?
No, that's a great question. And as you were discussing, primary data are data that are collected by the researcher themselves for a specific purpose to address a specific research question. Secondary data are data that are used by the researcher, but were initially collected for another purpose, or data that were collected by other researchers or investigators altogether. Collecting data is a really difficult process. You have to oftentimes develop a survey, make sure it's valid, recruit into your sample, and then, collect the data and then go through the process to make sure that the data you collected are valid. By using secondary data, you are not involved in the recruitment process. You are not involved in designing the survey for addressing your particular research question. So there's a lot of time and potential cost savings there for the researcher. Of course, there's drawbacks. Life is about trade-offs.
Right.
But there are a lot of benefits of secondary data.
Yeah, I could see that, and I guess especially when one thinks of the pandemic and trying to recruit people for a research study, I wonder how many people will be using secondary data, for their studies, and we'll see that in the next year or so coming into the publications.
I know that for the work I've done over the pandemic, I have used exclusively secondary data, but I that is also, with my work and the work I do, I do use secondary data most of the time. So I'm a big proponent of the benefits of secondary data sources.
So what are some of the issues? It sounds like there's, as you said, it can be a time saver and a cost saver, but is it more difficult to use secondary data? I mean, what are some of the issues in using data that's really been collected for other purposes?
That's a really good question, and it really depends on, the type of secondary data you're using. So if you're using, a smaller secondary data source, you can, dive in and start, analyzing the data. But, if you're using larger secondary data sources, often there's more kind of statistical techniques that you need to use to make sure that, your results are going to be generalizable and valid. And, it's called complex survey design. And so you need to incorporate that in your analysis. So that piece can be a little bit intimidating. That said, those large secondary data sources, you typically have thousands and thousands of questions. When you're using secondary data, you kind of have to take what you can get. You can't design a question to say answer. You're not designing the question, so you can't say, I want to collect this specific piece of data. You find the secondary data source and you have the data already there. And hopefully there's something in it that, it resonates with your research question and allows you to kind of move forward with an analysis. So it's, please.
I was going to say, so I imagine sometimes you might start out with a research question, but because of the database that you end up using or selecting, you have to kind of tweak your question a bit.
That's exactly how I would put it. You start out, and this is with a lot of research projects. You start out with this ideal or this goal, and then there's this like slow awareness of the realities. And with secondary data, the realities are the variables are already set, they're already been measured, and those are what are available. And so you have to kind of, tweak things a little bit. So, if you were measuring depression, maybe you wanted to use another instrument or another measure, but the only measure that they have in the data set are like the Kessler K9 scale. And that's what you have to use because that was what was measured. Or, often, for instance, another limitation too, not only has to do with the variables, but the study sample. So if you're looking at a highly specific study sample, say, homeless youth or transient youth, it's hard to find a data set that, is generalizable to or is reflective of that population. So it's not just like the variables, but it also can be, the population, who you want to study. And that can also be a limitation.
Yeah. So, I mean, you briefly mentioned your work that you use a lot of secondary data. Could you talk a little bit about some of the research that you've done that you've used the data for?
Yeah, definitely. The most recent work I've done relates to California Proposition 56, which was enacted in the latter part of like 2017. And basically it was an excise tax on cigarettes. And so, I was interested in looking at the effects of a excise tax or a price increase on smoking behavior. Do people smoke less? And did people who still continue to smoke less intensely or smoke fewer cigarettes? And then I was kind of curious about the effects across income groups. So was the effect different for lower income populations versus higher income populations? And so to answer that question, I used my team and I used a large survey data set, the California Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And it, again, has thousands and thousands of variables, and it's really, a wonderful resource. It's a complex survey design. So, you had to address that in the analysis. One interesting thing, and this speaks to your question about cost of data, is that the survey changed between 2019 and 2020. So the variables that I used for my analysis, 2012 to, 18, 19, I can't include the year 2020 because those data aren't going to be there anymore. So that's an example of being able to take what you can get. And for me, that meant now moving forward, I might want to consider an alternative data source for continuing that work, or maybe reframing my variable.
Okay, that's a great example of, as you said, taking what you can get and adjusting accordingly. So, So is there like one common place or a sticky point where most new researchers might get tripped up?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the first place for starting is, what is your research question? What do you want to study? And then kind of thinking about where you want to go, like how, if you don't feel like you want to collect the data yourself, like where do you go and where do you find those secondary data sources? One really good option is talking to your colleagues, staying connected to a community of clinical nurses who are doing their own work and asking them for advice, asking them about where they might have gotten their data. And that could
Hmm.
be a really great resource for, uh, accessing something that you might not have known was there. Um,
Hmm.
and then, I really, really find that these secondary data sources are really rich. But I do think that they're also intimidating. I think stats in general can be really scary. When I teach statistics to my students, I talk about, the first step we have to do is heal past mathematical trauma that, everyone comes
That's a
into it,
great comment.
right? Everyone comes into this thinking, I can't do this. This is really scary. And if you look at these, secondary data websites, they can be really, really intimidating. And, I get that. I get that it's intimidating. But, it's also like, I feel like it's something that clinical nurses, I want to empower them to feel like this is something that they can tackle. And maybe
Hmm.
you can't tackle it, just on your own, but I think that's a lesson in life that, ask for help when you need it. And, by teaming with other folks, hopefully, that would create opportunities for clinical nurses to access really rich data and apply their clinical expertise to address research questions. I'm working on this series. A lot of the papers that I'm working on are with Dr. Alexa Curtis. So my background is in public health. I am not a nurse, and Alexa is. And so it's amazing for me to kind of understand and see the world through her clinical lens. I actually have, through the experience, a better appreciation for the importance of the clinical perspective in my own public health work.
Hmm.
And I think similarly, when you talk about working with complex survey data, I think that kind of pairing could be really cool and produce some
Hmm.
really innovative research that harnesses the intuition and the knowledge that clinical nurses have.
This seems to be the age of collaboration. We just started another column called Nurse Innovators, and it's written by a nurse and an engineer. And I did a podcast with the authors, and um, the engineer ended up becoming a nurse because
Wow.
she was developing all these products and getting this feedback, and she ended up getting very interested in nursing. And then she says now she laughs when she's as a nurse in the clinical area and she gets these products in and she reads the description of how to use it, and she said, I laugh, she says, because I know an engineer had no clue what nurses do when he wrote this. So they're now collaborating on developing products that are really nurse-led innovations that are really much more usable. So I think it's just great that people are starting to really collaborate in the different fields because, as you said, everybody brings a different lens to a
Yeah.
problem or an issue. So I think that it'll just make things just much richer and more useful and
Yeah.
probably more accurate.
I agree. I agree. I mean, again, like I feel like for so many aspects of the series, I feel like we're trying to open doors and help people feel empowered and realize that this is something that they can tackle. And I think,
Mhm.
I hope as, clinical nurses dive into this work and think about pursuing some research topics that they remember the strength and knowledge and expertise that they have. And yes, the questions that they have are important and need to be asked and need to be explored.
That's a great thought, and actually a great way to end this conversation. I can't think of a better ending. So I do hope people who are listening either go to the website ajnonline.com, or if they get AJN in print, do look at the articles, not only this one but all the articles in the series, and we do have them under collections. We collected them all there, so you can see all the different articles. But the other thing about this particular article, you talked about secondary data sets, and you also have a listing, a table of some great data sets in there, and the links to them and what they might be used for. So I think that'll be a really helpful resource on its own for people. So thank you for doing that as well. So thank you so much for again, for the article and for taking time to chat about it. I look forward to more articles in the series. I think there's a whole lineup that we're still going through.
We are. I am just starting work on hypothesis testing. It's been such a privilege to talk with you, and a privilege to be part of this project.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney, for doing this.
Thank you.
Okay, we're good.
Okay.
That was great. That was great. You got a lot of good points, and your passion comes through, so that's great.
I hope so. I try to I genuinely feel like, and I encounter this with my students as well. It's research and all of this. Students can be very self-defeatist, and I want people to champion folks and make sure that they know that this is something that they can do. And I truly am being honest. I have absolutely loved doing this.
Oh, good.
It's been so fun.
I loved your comment about math trauma, because I have to tell you, when I was in my undergraduate program, and of course you had to take statistics, and I would take it and then get into it and not that I'm terrible, I always did okay in math, but just somehow statistics. Yeah. And so I would take it and then drop it. And I probably took it and dropped it 3 times, because I would just, the professor would go on. And finally, it was like spring semester of my senior year, and I thought, oh God, I have no choice. And so I took it, and it was like, I got a good professor who was very, cognizant of people's anxiety about it. And it was great. It was a great course. So,
yeah.
But I really identified with that math trauma.
Well, and that, I think everyone has that same experience. Like, my first stats class was not, I didn't come away thinking, gosh, this is amazing, let's do more of this. I was just fortunate in grad school to have someone that I found really inspiring, and their learning or teaching style works for me. And
yeah,
so I hope that's what this series does for folks, that they are able to kind of move away from some of the fear of it.
Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you so much, and it was so great to meet you. And maybe one day we'll meet in person. Who knows?
I hope so. But until then, I'm just thank you for everything, and thank you for including me in this.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Have a good weekend.
You too.